You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sebastian Duque Rios, and today's episode is a special one because we're here celebrating the leadership that's shaping the future of environmental protection. The Environmental Law Institute is proud to announce that the 2025 Environmental Achievement Award will go to Ben Grumbles and the Environmental Council of States, or ECOS. This award recognizes individuals and organizations making remarkable contributions to conservation, sustainability, and environmental governance, and Ben and ECOS exemplify those values at every level. Ben Grumbles has long been a driving force in water policy and environmental leadership. From his time as Maryland's Secretary of the Environment and his time as Arizona's Director of Environmental Quality, to EPA Assistant Administrator for Water, to his current role as President of ECOS, Ben has championed collaborative, science-based approaches to our most pressing challenges. Under his leadership, ECOS has been a vital voice for state environmental agencies, advancing innovative bipartisan solutions to everything from climate resilience to chemical safety. Today, Ben will be joining us alongside three of his colleagues to reflect on this recognition, the importance of collaboration, and the crucial role of state environmental leadership. We're honored to be joined by James Kenney, the Cabinet Secretary of the New Mexico Environment Department. He brings over 2 decades of experience in environmental enforcement and policy, including prior service at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Chris Wells, who is the Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality. With a background in engineering and law, he oversees programs that manage air, water, and waste, as well as coastal restoration efforts. And finally, Leah Feldon, who is the director of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. She has led major initiatives including Oregon's air toxics program and has a background in environmental compliance and enforcement. Ben, Jim, Chris, and Leah, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
And think of anywhere I'd rather be.
Well, Ben, maybe we can get started with you. What does it mean to you and to ECOS to receive the Environmental Achievement Award from ELI this year?
We're delighted about this award, this achievement from ELI to ECOS. We're over 30 years old, this organization. It's a nonprofit educational group that also advocates to the federal government on behalf of the states. And so it's very nice and fitting. And every ECOS member, the 50 top environmental regulators in the 50 states and also the District of Columbia and territories, they're not in these public service jobs for environmental achievement awards. However, it feels really good, particularly at this moment, to be sharing an award with the states who play such a critical role in advancing environmental protection and public health and the economy.
Thank you, Ben. It's clear that this award speaks not just to individual leadership, but to the essential role that states play in driving environmental progress across the country. Of course, that work is also very connected to whatever is happening here in Washington.
So what brings you all to Washington, D.C. today? Thanks, Sebastian. The Environmental Council of the States is hosting a fly-in of state environmental secretaries, directors, and this morning we kicked off our focus with lobbying on the Hill with a breakfast. And that breakfast was really a good kickstart to the day. We had associations representing the private sector and associations representing, I'll call it the public sector, interested in water issues or solid waste issues, all in the same room. ECOS put that together and we shared a little bit about what our priorities are, whether that is certainty and timelines for permitting for the private sector or how environmental organizations provide funding to municipal governments. All those sort of representatives of our customer base, if you will, were in the room talking about the importance of federal funding to state agencies. So it's one of those rare moments where you get the American Petroleum Institute and the National Association of Manufacturers, along with the Association of Clean Water Agencies, air agencies, all sort of rallying around, hey, you state environmental agencies need full funding, and we recognize that. And from there, we went and met with Senate appropriations staff as well as the senators and talked a lot about what's at stake in communities all across the country if funding isn't made available. And it was a really productive time to see a bipartisan group of people come together and head over to the Hill and tell our story.
And we did that on the House side as well. There was Senate and House with a great diversity of environmental leaders from states around the country.
That's a great picture of what these visits to the Hill are like, and it sounds like you all had a rare but important moment of alignment with the many different actors that were present. And Jim, maybe starting with you, when we talk about the importance of federal-state partnerships, especially around funding, what's really at stake if that support starts to fall short? When federal funding for state environmental programs is reduced or cut?
Yeah, Sebastian, that's a great question. The states are so reliant on what Congress intended for these environmental programs to work, which is Congress said the federal government and states are to implement these programs, and then states took primacy or delegation of these programs nationally. So when Congress is not funding states, then states are not able to deliver on that proposition of cooperative federalism. What that looks like is communities in New Mexico and all across the country are going to have less funding to provide permits, to provide water infrastructure projects, to really further the economy in those states. It's a critical time, a critical juncture, and it's exactly why ECOS is lobbying in a bipartisan way to ensure that Congress understands that a lack of funding will actually slow our economies and not build them.
It's great to hear from your own perspective, everything that's at stake with the budget and in the next couple of months as Congress makes some big fiscal decisions. However, I did want to ask you about non-financial support too, such as technical assistance. Beyond funding, how could less collaboration between states and the federal government have cross-cutting impacts on the environment?
So another good question. I think about New Mexico as being typical of many other states. And let's talk about drinking water. Whenever we turn on our tap, we assume that we're going to get safe and reliable drinking water. That is not often the case across many of our states. And the issue there is operators who run those drinking water treatment plants, as well as those technicians who serve in that capacity, you can't find them. They're hard to find. Drinking water treatment plants all across the US are having trouble with that issue. So states often step in and provide technical assistance. People may be familiar with us providing grants or maybe providing permits or even taking enforcement actions. What they don't see is on a day-to-day basis, state employees are providing technical assistance to the safe and successful operation of those facilities all across the US. And that function that we perform, if not funded or not happening, is a loss in that shared proposition of clean water. So it's really important, again, that we continue to think about what are our priorities as states. Clean, reliable drinking water. You need that for communities. You need that for economic development. Think about this. What community is going to get a data center, right? If that data center, those employees have to live and drink water that has high levels of arsenic in it or high levels of chlorinated byproducts. So you can't separate out the economy from clean, reliable drinking water, and nor would we want to. We want to continue to provide that technical assistance, but we need to be funded in order to make that happen. So that's just one example of how states are working cooperatively to provide that technical assistance.
Thanks, Jim. You've really highlighted how state agencies quietly carry so much of the day-to-day responsibility for keeping essential services like drinking water safe and reliable. Building on that, let's turn to an example where strong federal-state collaboration has made a real difference. Chris, I understand Mississippi had a case involving Superfund cleanup that really shows what's possible when states and EPA work hand in hand. Could you walk us through that?
We have an example in Mississippi of a Superfund site that is the quintessential example of how state and federal governments should work together. This was a fertilizer plant. Phosphogypsum was the byproduct, and the company went bankrupt. And EPA has taken over the site, the Superfund site, but done it so in a way that avoided the state cost share that is triggered under CERCLA for a period of time. It's a good example of how state and EPA can work together because it started with an enforcement action, a joint enforcement action between EPA and the state of Mississippi against this company. This eventually led to the bankruptcy. But to handle that Superfund remediation in such a way as to avoid and minimize the financial impact on the state, and Mississippi is a poor state, to allow us to focus our resources in other areas while at the same time accomplishing the cleanup of a site that was left by the company and posed a risk to the environment, I think is the kind of thing that we want to see. It's a good example of cooperative federalism and the state and EPA working together to accomplish a shared goal.
Yeah, Sebastian, I was going to add an example that's similar. In downtown Albuquerque, New Mexico, there's a former dry cleaning site that the state doesn't have the money to clean it up to safe levels. And we're talking about an area of Albuquerque that's going through a bit of a renaissance. You can get condos and lofts. There's a new food market there, a food hall. It's kind of a great part of Albuquerque. And right on the edge of that is that old dry cleaning site that spilled all this dry cleaner solvent into the ground, affecting the groundwater there. So much so that people were worried about the vapors coming in to their residents, right? So it's a real issue. And that collaboration between EPA and the state of New Mexico led to both corrective actions, but listing it on the national priorities list in a way that it's going to free up money that the state wouldn't otherwise have to devote to that. Like other states, we have more challenges to clean up industrial sites than we have dollars available to do that. So the Superfund program is absolutely essential to taking those old brownfields and turning them into a productive parcel for New Mexico to continue to redevelop and grow.
Jim, your example helps drive home the importance of cooperative federalism when it comes to ensuring that there is enough funding and capacity at state agencies to be able to do what needs to get done. However, there is another critical part of the equation when it comes to environmental issues: science. Chris, how do you see the role of EPA's scientific work in supporting what states are trying to accomplish on the ground?
I think it's important that as federal government under the current administration is looking for ways to save the taxpayers of the country money, that EPA serves a role with respect to science that the states are not equipped to play. And that is, under the federal environmental statutes, EPA is responsible for setting national standards for consistency, for level playing fields. States are not equipped to do that science, to do the research, the core scientific research that forms the foundation of all of the regulatory work that we do. And so it's important that while there may be room for efficiency and maybe room for reducing staff and expenditures at EPA, that the research function be adequately funded and that they continue to fill that role in a way that the states just simply cannot.
Chris, I think it is really important that we understand how EPA's scientific capacity can support state efforts. To talk more about that, I'd like to bring in Leah Feldon, Director of Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality. Leah, how do states like Oregon ensure that science and evidence remain at the center of policy development, especially as new environmental issues arise?
Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, I think for the states, we're certainly always looking to take the best science that's in place and ensure it is relevant to a particular state's issues and make sound policy that addresses an issue at the right level. And we want to help business and industry, of course, evolve practices that better align with environmental goals. And we realize that can't be achieved overnight. States primarily look to EPA and specifically the Office of Research and Development as a trusted source for research and science and data to back federal and state policy initiatives. So this federal level of research and development is not really achievable at the state level. The resources and capacity simply don't exist. So this partnership that we have is crucial in our mission to protect public health and the environment.
And when there is a gap in the evidence or science that's offered at the federal level, is there any research capacity at the state level?
Sure. The policy and science needs at the state level are certainly not a one size fits all. The collaboration in research between the feds and the states is key as the states face various issues that require state or region specific solutions. And much of this can be accomplished through state level policymaking, but that still, of course, requires the solid scientific foundation that all states use. I think the degree to which the states are doing research, well, it varies quite a bit depending on individual state capacity. Some states wouldn't have that capacity at all. A few have some of that. As my colleagues have noted, ECOS's Environmental Research Institute of the states conducts environmental policy research, and they disseminate those results to the states. ERIS also acts as a forum where state environmental policymakers and scientists interact with other environmental stakeholders, including business interests regarding environmental policy in the U.S. So it's really a forum where states can talk about the needs that they have or those gaps, if you will, in science and research. And so these are really critical venues for these discussions and ongoing collaboration for the science needs.
You just highlighted one of the reasons we're so proud to be honoring ECOS with this award. I think bridging those gaps between states and being able to assist in building the science and evidence-based policy at the state level is a really important role. So moving on to PFAS, which has been a long-standing concern for many state agencies, what are some tools or scientific resources that have made the biggest difference in responding effectively?
Yes, a couple of specific tools that come to mind are EPA's PFAS roadmap and the destruction and disposal guidance, the latter being a product of EPA's Office of Research and Development, which is really valuable to our treatment and disposal sectors. As we all have learned or are learning, PFAS is labeled a forever chemical, and that's because of its very strong bonds. And so learning methodologies for destruction of those bonds and then ultimate disposal in a safe way so that the contaminant doesn't re-enter the environment is really important for so many states across the nation that have faced a lot of issues with PFAS to varying degrees. EPA has also released a drinking water standard for PFAS, which certainly is going to be helpful in appropriate cleanup levels for groundwater contamination. Many states also have their own initiatives in determining the level and extent of PFAS in certain media in their own territories. So many states have former Department of Defense sites or current, and some have acutely contaminated industrial sites. And I highlight that just to say there are going to be varying degrees of need for immediate PFAS policymaking on a state-by-state basis. But for those states that are in that space of policymaking, having the science at the ready is really key. There's a ton of work going on at EPA's Office of Research and Development in partnership with the Environmental Research Institute of the states that I mentioned earlier, and the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, a program of ERIS, in collaboration with industry partners to develop the science on PFAS. And this is really critical and collaborative work that we hope will continue to develop the needed policy around PFAS to protect public health.
Great. Thank you for highlighting some of the really important work that's going on around PFAS at EPA and through ECOS as well. Building on what we were talking about earlier around how states are already ensuring that science and evidence are at the forefront, what does a healthy science policy pipeline look like at the state level? So, who is responsible for strengthening communication between scientists and policymakers?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, not to emphasize collaboration too much, if that's possible, but I think that really is the key. It's keeping a strong partnership, frankly, no matter the administration, no matter where we're at in a given time. The partnership between EPA and the states is really critical for that science policy pipeline. The science that EPA develops is considered generally a trusted source. And so when states are considering policy objectives, they really need that strong foundation to start from. So as I've said, the primary nationwide mechanism for this is really through EPA's Office of Research and Development and through the Environmental Research Institute of the states. and again with the ITRC program. I sit on the ERIS board, and what we do is we have meetings with the Office of Research and Development and convey to EPA the most pressing science and research needs. And EPA in turn develops methods, data, and guidance for the states to utilize. And the states' needs differ in many ways, of course. But having the consistent foundation for scientific methodologies is critical to ensuring sound national policy and a level playing field. There's a few examples that I'd like to highlight of the work that supports states that I've seen in my time in the last several years. They include developing reliable air pollution models, greenhouse gas calculation methodologies, harmful algal bloom monitoring protocols, laboratory analyses for groundwater contamination, developing risk-based concentrations for cleanup levels, and as the foundation for toxicology in many programs, and impacts of smoke from wildfires. So I think in terms of the responsibility, it's all of ours. Communication between the states and with EPA is key to ensuring that we as leaders of environmental protection for our states can uphold our responsibility of environmental protection for the public.
Those are some great examples, and I think really drive the point home of something that keeps on coming up, which is the importance of collaboration, right, at the state and federal level. Thinking about all this science that's coming in combination with some of the pressing challenges that you just mentioned in these examples, how do state environmental leaders weigh the need for thorough science-based assessments and scientific consensus with the pressure to act quickly on urgent environmental challenges, especially when states sometimes have the opportunity to pursue more innovative actions than at the federal level?
This is a great question, and it's very state dependent and issue dependent. If states are facing particularly urgent challenges, such as extreme wildfire or PFAS contamination or contaminated drinking water, there's going to be issues that cause these to come to the forefront for a state's legislative body and for its executive branch policymakers. The urgency of a particular issue doesn't necessarily mean that the policymakers are acting ahead of the science, as there is science out there on all of these issues, but they might be ahead of other states or the federal government in the policy when they need to be. In Oregon, we learned in 2016 that we had some industries that were emitting toxics into the air at unsafe levels, and this was not in violation of any state or federal regulation. And this caused us to gather the best science with EPA's help and from other sources to create a very robust air toxics program. So sometimes the issues that arise create the space for robust health-based policy that makes sense and is backed by science, but isn't necessarily what the majority of states are doing at that moment in time. Some states have had to take policy and regulatory forward approaches on PFAS due to specific industrial contamination issues that they have found in those states. And the science is there to support them, and the urgency is acute for that particular state at that moment in time. Naturally, our policies have to evolve over time, and the federal-state partnership needs to be strong to best support appropriate national and state-level policy.
Thank you, Leah. And I think a lot of our listeners have a sense of what research and science looks at the federal level, but what does it look like in practice when you invite them into the state to help with something that is maybe state specific, as you were talking about with the toxins that were being emitted in Oregon? What does that process look like of bringing them into the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure many states have different experiences. I only have an Oregon experience, and it's probably somewhat issue specific. There are issues where we have sought EPA assistance and help where I would say the science is largely developed, but perhaps the regulatory structure and mechanisms are not there at the federal level. So I think that was definitely the case with the air toxics work. We were looking for some help in terms of actual on-the-ground monitoring, but largely what we needed was to understand more risk-based concentration levels based on toxicology work that EPA had already done. It's just that all of the contaminants that needed to be regulated weren't necessarily regulated at the federal level, and for Oregon at that time, not at the state level either. There are other instances where we are really in partnership and EPA is sort of a force multiplier, a capacity builder on the ground with developing new research, new science. And an example of that, I would say, is with wildfire. Oregon is certainly a state that is heavily impacted by wildfire and smoke. And some of the research collaboration that's going on right now between Oregon and EPA has to do with smoke impacts, but also impacts from wildfire that maybe aren't the immediate and obvious terrible destruction and trauma that we experience in terms of structures that are impacted, but what happens in terms of erosion? What happens to our waterways after catastrophic wildfire? So some of that work is being done right now, the impacts to soil and water from wildfire. So that's just an example where EPA really comes in and is the capacity builder for a state that is looking into a particular issue.
Yeah, I think that'll be really helpful for our listeners to get a better sense of how that process works. So we've talked about the role of the federal government and of states in producing science to back evidence-based policy, but I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the role of other actors. Do universities or academic institutions play a role in helping states develop this evidence-based policy, or any other actors besides them?
Yeah, that's certainly the case. The EPA and the Office of Research and Development is certainly, at the federal level, a body that provides for that robust and trusted science. But at the state level, it's not just at the state departments of environmental quality or departments of natural resources. There are a lot of partners through academia at the local universities that are developing a lot of science and research that we depend on as policymakers. And that partnership is really critical. In Oregon, we've experienced that in terms of toxicology, largely in our air programs. So I think that is really critical, and that work is very valuable. And business also plays a role with the ITRC through the Environmental Research Institute of States. Many business partners come to the table as well to help with research needs and development in terms of managing contamination.
Thanks, Leah. Our listeners will appreciate hearing more about how science is a collaborative effort, not just between the states and EPA, but with universities, businesses, and other partners working together to inform smart policy. Let's pivot now to permitting and infrastructure. Chris, these issues have been front and center nationally, especially the push to streamline permitting without compromising environmental protection. From your perspective, what does that look like in practice at the state level?
Well, there's a not so old adage that we are all constantly having to do more with less these days. We spend a lot of time talking about the need to adequately fund both EPA and the state regulatory agencies. But the reality is we're dealing with more issues than just funding. Money doesn't solve every problem. And so we're having to constantly find ways to be more efficient in the way we do our jobs, more efficient in the way we write permits in particular. There's an expectation from the regulated community that environmental regulators not hold up projects. It's my personal belief that economic development and environmental protection are not mutually exclusive concepts. And I think that most, if not all, of my counterparts in other states would agree with that. It is important that we balance that and make sure that we are writing permits that are protective of human health and the environment while doing so in a way that is not disruptive of economic development.
And Chris, to follow up on that, how are states ensuring that efforts to accelerate permitting don't come at the expense of environmental integrity? Are there guardrails in place to prevent faster permitting from becoming irresponsible permitting?
Well, I think what you'll find when you really dig deep is that people that come to work for environmental regulatory agency, particularly at the state level, but really at both federal and state level, generally speaking, they're true believers in the mission. And I know that for the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, the people that we have working for us take the mission of the agency very seriously. It's possible to balance responsible, reasonable environmental regulation with the economic growth and do so in such a ways that we don't cut corners on the permitting and making sure that we are writing permits that, assuming compliance with them, are protective and then be prepared to take enforcement as appropriate to make sure that those who are not willing to comply or who may be prone to not fulfilling their obligations under the permits are held accountable.
And Sebastian, I'm just going to jump in on this too, because I think I agree with Chris that you can have permit streamlining, you can have permit priority. If you think about traveling on the highway, like an easy pass kind of way to get through, you don't have to compromise. And there's a notion that federally or at the state level, depending on administrations, that streamlined permitting is somehow a dilution of the protection. And I've seen permits over my history as an environmental regulator at the federal and state level that the permit is not protective, but went through the entire process as it should. And times where industry is moving in a more protective way than the permit requires. I just want to dispel that notion a little bit that streamlining means less effective permitting. I think environmental agencies are constantly looking for ways to streamline the process. And if you think about the grocery store, for example, something we can all relate to, when you go and pick up your groceries and you decide you're going to do self-checkout, and sometimes that's a little bit quicker and you move through the line faster versus you push your basket into the aisle where someone is checking you out. That's maybe a way to think about what permit streamlining looks like. Do we need to make a $50,000 state hearing over every permit that comes before us? No. We have the authority to go in and fix a permit for cause if we need to do that. But there should be a way to expedite and have still protective permits with those guardrails. And that's exactly what many of our states are doing, making sure we do that under the delegations and authorities we have from the federal government or our state legislature. But I like that notion of taking your basket through the self-checkout and ringing yourself out, because some things are easy. Some permits are easy, and we shouldn't be putting a professional engineer on a permit that doesn't need it. And we should be devoting those professional engineers on those more complicated permits, first of its kind, AI data center that's powered by a fusion process or something like that. That's novel, and we should put more people on that. But I don't think we need to put the same level of permit resources into every single permit. It's sort of redundant in many ways.
Yeah, I like the grocery store analogy. I've used it myself a number of times. A lot of permit streamlining is finding creative ways to open up additional lanes, additional cash registers, if you will. Either one might be the express lane or just more than one option for people. And I do think that requires us to think creatively. One example in Mississippi of that is our legislature a couple of years ago passed a piece of legislation that gave us the legal authority that we didn't previously have to essentially act as a pass-through from a funding standpoint, where we can enter into a contract with a consulting firm that does environmental work, knows what they're doing, just aren't employees of the agency. We can then enter into a contract with a permit applicant where that permit applicant is a voluntary program. It's not a fee, but that applicant agrees to pay the cost of us assigning their application to that contractor. So it takes some workload off of our employees, but it opens up another lane as an option to the permit applicant. We don't necessarily guarantee a quote unquote expedited permit, but the theory is that it's a shorter line for them to wait in. There may still be a line depending on how many people want to take advantage of the program and how much capacity the contractors have. But again, it's an example of creative thinking to open up additional avenues.
Chris, I like that. And maybe I took the analogy from hearing you speak in the past about the supermarket. But one thing about permit streamlining we also need to think about is we're more connected than ever with our energy sources, our water infrastructure, especially in the West. We're looking at other states and working with them. So the notion of permit streamlining also means looking across states to see how the federal government can weigh in on permit streamlining so that states can then connect pipelines, whether that's moving hydrocarbons or moving electrons from wind and solar, or moving water between West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, or tying into water exports to Arizona again from New Mexico. These are all the types of ways in which states are talking to each other. And that notion of streamlining permits is not just intrastate, but it's also with the federal government across states.
And that actually is a good segue to the idea of the e-enterprise. The e-enterprise is a joint effort for states and EPA and tribes to modernize the way we do business. A lot of discussion in that realm. And as Vice President of ECOS, I'm co-chair of the E-Enterprise Leadership Council. That was in the fine print of the job description for Vice President. Dovetailing back to the funding discussion previously, the E-Enterprise, that's another effort that has historically been funded through EPA. But the whole idea of that is finding ways that we can do things more efficiently using technology, using AI is the big conversation these days, but also learning from each other. Build it once and then replicate it is kind of the idea. If Jim figures out a way to do something because he's much smarter than me, then I can then take his idea and use it for our own benefits and working across state lines and working across government lines, if you will.
I think you're absolutely right, Chris. I am much smarter than you. And that is just a joke because I think it's important to show that our state commissioners, state secretaries, state directors, we spend so much time in the trenches together that we have a good camaraderie and banter between us all. The politics of our states don't really get in the way of us being productive when we're rallying around the same issues.
I think that speaks really well to the role that ECOS plays in helping states navigate and align complex policy landscapes, especially when multiple agencies and jurisdictions are involved.
You know, ECOS, I think, is one of those organizations that is critical for us to be able to get in the room together in a way that we can set aside, by and large, the politics that are going on at home. We can get in the room together, and Jim may be from a blue state and I may be from a red state, but I laugh at his jokes and he pretends to laugh at mine. And we get along, but we can share ideas. And we do that. We do that in a safe space, so to speak. We do that in a nonpartisan and bipartisan way. It gives me an opportunity to work with people and learn from people like Jim, who lives in a completely different part of the country, has different challenges ecologically and in a different EPA region. But for ECOS, I would never have necessarily crossed paths with Jim. We wouldn't have that marketplace of ideas. And I think that's an important role that ECOS plays. It helps facilitate conversations that otherwise wouldn't happen. Mississippi is in Region 4 of EPA. I interact with my Region 4 counterparts very frequently. I don't get that opportunity beyond the Southeast except through ECOS.
I would just add that I was Environment Secretary in Maryland and also the Environment Director in Arizona, and have seen over the years, and we all know this, at the federal level, there can be a tremendous pendulum swing in priorities and strategies when it comes to environmental policy and law. When the states come together, and ECOS is one organization that really focuses on education and collaboration of bringing the states together, not only to learn from one another, but to also react with and learn from and teach a new administration. And so one role for ECOS is to help provide stability among the states and learning among the states so that the federal environmental enterprise continues to move forward. That was the vision of ECOS when it was created. And I think it now more than ever, it's a form of stability, hopefully nationally and regionally, as sometimes ECOS members in certain regions caucus and get together on what are the biggest challenges, since the challenges depend on the different regions, hydrologically, politically, geologically. So that's one way that ECOS helps facilitate those necessary discussions and learning opportunities among environmental regulators.
Ben, you draw a really important connection between ECOS's role as a stabilizing force and the realities of shifting priorities at the federal level. And I think that's a role that a lot of organizations play throughout the country as well. That ability to foster continuity and collaboration across administrations and across states is clearly really critical to our environmental governance. As we wrap up, I'd like to turn to the future a little bit. What's one thing that gives either of you confidence or concern about the future of state and federal collaboration on the environment?
Well, that's a good question. So on a day-to-day basis, our job is to focus on some of the concerns that come up. But I like your question about what gives you confidence. I'll take that as what gives you optimism. And I think when I look around at the arc of where we've been in the past, and there have been uncertain times in prior administrations, and now we're moving through this one, I think what gives me confidence and optimism is that ECOS as an organization has always been a leveling organization to bring states together to invite EPA, and we also invite the Department of Energy, DOD in, et cetera. And we sit in a room and have real conversations that is respecting the political boundaries of the organizations that are there, but solving problems at the same time. So we've been consistently able to navigate really hard topics, PFAS, circular economy, water issues, and even funding issues over the years in a way that we can step back and still have productive conversations, even in times that are feeling uncertain. And this is one of those times. So I think that's what gives me optimism and confidence that we're going to continue to move in the right direction and be productive as states in working with the federal government. And ECOS is really going to be the common denominator there.
And Chris, if you had a message for environmental leaders, maybe at the federal level, but also in business and in other sectors in the nonprofit sector too, what message would you share with them if they're interested in collaborating with states and protecting health and the environment?
To answer that, I think of another adage that if we as environmental regulators are doing our job, then nobody's completely comfortable or nobody is completely satisfied, so to speak. There are those in certain sectors that would prefer that we not regulate. There are those that feel like we never regulate enough. I think recognizing that we as public servants, as I alluded to earlier, we do the jobs that we do, not for the fame and fortune. We do it for the mission. We do it because we believe in what we're doing and that we can make a difference, and that we're always open to working with anyone that's willing to work with us to find better ways to do our job, to do things more efficiently, to do things more effectively, to do things in a way that gives confidence in all sectors, that we are fair, that we are diligent, and that at the end of the day, we're going to do the right thing.
I would add one thing, and I constantly try to underscore this with federal and private sector leaders and local leaders, and that is it's important to strive for and recognize the importance of national standards with neighborhood solutions that are customized, implemented, funded, and supported by the states. And so what gives me hope is that as states continue to share the message that currently 50 states have primacy under the Clean Air Act, and 49 states have primacy under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and 48 states have primacy under RCRA, hazardous waste law, and 47 states, hopefully soon to be 48 with New Mexico, have primacy under the Clean Water Act permitting programs. Those are really important, and everybody who's collaborating with the states needs to understand that states will be successful if they have local and federal and private sector partners in the same room together. So it's not just about funding. It's about engaging in a conversation with the many different players. And so it's very important to have national standards, neighborhood solutions, and understand that states are the ones that have signed up for and want to be the primary implementers and enforcers of these programs.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation, and congratulations to you again, Ben, and all of ECOS. It's been great to hear about the work that ECOS is doing and the way that the states are collaborating and learning from each other through conversations and banter, and generally helping to build a better environmental governance framework and environment for everybody. And the conversations we've had today are just the beginning. These and many more will continue this fall when nearly all 50 state environmental leaders gather for the ECOS Fall Meeting taking place September 2nd through 5th in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They'll be joined by federal and local officials, NGOs, and business leaders, all focused on strengthening cooperative federalism and advancing environmental progress across the country. Come October, ELI will be formally presenting Ben and the Environmental Council of States with the Environmental Achievement Award during our annual award dinner. Thanks again to all of our guests, and thanks to you for listening. Until next time.
Thank you for having us.
Really appreciated it.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.